You got the basic introduction and overview outline. So we're going to talk about some preliminary comments and then get into some very specific things. Now, first of all, in the preliminary context, isagogical matters, we do have some important testimony from the early church fathers, and especially from Papias. So Papias, somewhere early 2nd century, and his statement from Ecclesiastical History 3 of Eusebius says the following, in my own translation. Mark, because he had become the interpreter of Peter, wrote accurately, not, however, in order, the things either said or done by the Lord, as many as he remembered. For he did not hear the Lord, nor follow him, but later, as I declared, Peter. He, or who, referring to Peter, used to compose the teachings relative to the needs, but not under the impression that he was composing a systematic treatise of the Dominical utterances, with the result that Mark erred in no way by writing some things in this way, as he remembered them. For he carefully took prior thought of one thing, to leave out nothing of the things he had heard, nor to falsify anything in them. Now, in this statement, there are a couple of very important things. And for those of you who know Greek, I'm going to put a few words up here that are, you might say, striking. Now, he says, he did not hear the Lord, but later, as I declared, Peter, who used to compose, and now this is a middle voice verb. And that's why I translated it compose, eppoiaito. He used to make, that is to say, make for himself, and I'm using the translation compose. The teachings relative to the needs, or in reference to the needs, pros, but not under the impression that, and this is hos plus the participles, a very kind of sophisticated use. Hos plus the participle, not operating under the impression that he was composing a systematic treatise. And again, we have a middle voice form, poiumenos, a participle. These two go together. A systematic treatise of the Dominical utterances, and the Greek word there is logia. So it's logeon here in this text. Oh, logeon, because it's genitive plural. And now again, with the result that Mark erred in no way, and the word for error here is hamartano. Hamartan, sinned, i.e. missed the mark. He missed the mark in no way. It's a good example here of a meaning that is, it doesn't mean sin in the context of you're trying to compose something. You hit the mark. You didn't miss the mark. In no way, by writing some things in this way, as he remembered them. For he carefully took prior thought. Where did I get that carefully from? another middle voice form. Epoiesata. Of one thing, to leave out nothing of the things he had heard, nor to falsify anything in them. Now, what is very important is the notion that Peter composed the teachings relative to the needs. Used to compose, regularly compose. This is imperfect. And that, I think, is the key. Bo Reicha, with whom I, at the University of Basel, with whom I did postdoc work in '83, was very big on this, and he was very good at the early fathers. He said this notion of Papias' statement of composing relative to needs really gives Mark the latitude of, so to speak, putting together something that is not like a Lucan idea of doing some strict historiography. Notice that thing about the logia. Isn't that interesting? That a systematic treatise of the dominical utterances or reports, the logia. Because a report of the dominical logia, those of you who are for higher criticism can see the Q stuff floating around in that logia sort of idea, that there was an independent source of Jesus' sayings. Now, it doesn't say that here, but it's just a very interesting statement. Now, that Papias early 2nd century statement is the earliest statement we have on the gospel. It's the earliest one. And this is why on your outline it is down as A1A separately. I could have put it together with Irenaeus, Clement, and Origen, but it is kind of singularly significant because of its date and its attention to detail. Now, late 2nd century, Irenaeus, so let's say 180-ish, said the following. Now, he says this concerning the 3 Gospels. Let me read my translation. Matthew, among the Hebrews, produced also a writing of a gospel in their own language, or dialectic, while Peter and Paul in Rome were evangelizing and founding the church. Wow, huh? That really locates something, doesn't it? So you're talking about the early 60s. After the exit of these men, and the word is exodus, after the exodus of these men, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, also himself in writing, handed down to us as tradition, paraedoken. That is, paradidomi is the verb that is always used for the official handing down of tradition. Paul uses that when he says, what I received, I hand on also to you. He handed down to us as tradition the things that used to be proclaimed by Peter. And also Luke, the follower of Paul, placed down in a book the gospel that was regularly proclaimed by him. And then John. So he's got an interesting order there, which is the traditional order of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, just the way he's talking about that. Now, next comes Clement of Alexandria. Clement is late 2nd century, kind of around the time of this, early 3rd. And here's what Eusebius says. Again, in the same books, Clement has laid out with care, middle voice, tethite type, concerning the arrangement of the gospel, the tradition of the elders from the beginning, which has this manner. He used to say that the gospels, get this, folks, the gospels containing the genealogy were written first. Now, which are those? Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke. And that the gospel according to Mark got and possessed, SK perfect, this arrangement or plan. After Peter had proclaimed the word publicly in Rome, and by the Spirit had spoken forth the gospel, those present, who were numerous, exhorted Mark to write up the things spoken, under the supposition, hos, that he had followed him long before, and still had in his memory the things that had been said. And that after he had done this, he shared the gospel with those petitioning him. And that after knowing about this, Peter, in an encouraging way, neither prevented nor urged this on. And that John, last, upon seeing that the bodily things were made plain in the Gospels, made a spiritual gospel. So, frankly, as you'll see, I'll get on to in this hour, I think that's the layout, frankly, that's worth following. The two Gospels with the genealogies are done first. One to the Jews, one to the Gentiles. And then you have two further takes on the story. John is the spiritual gospel, and Mark as the gospel of the proclamation of Peter. So they, in other words, the four gospels kind of each have a different focus, which is why there are four and not why there is one. But this is very interesting. Now, for those of you who are mavens of isagogics and so on, this is essentially the Griesbach hypothesis, that Mark is the summarizer of Matthew and Luke, rather than being the first gospel. But you notice, Clement does not say that. He said that Mark is writing up what Peter wrote, not that he was messing around with manuscripts and stuff like that. All right, and then we have Origen. Origen, late 1st to the middle of the 2nd century. Late 2nd to the middle of the 3rd century. So of these, he's the latest one. Eusebius says, Origen bears witness that he knows only 4 Gospels, writing here something like this, conveying that he had learned concerning the 4 Gospels, which alone are undisputed in the Church of God under heaven. Antireta. Antireta. So, on alpha privative, not spoken against. They are the only ones that are not spoken against, the 4 Gospels. The first stands written, the Gospel according to the one-time tax collector, but later apostle of Jesus Christ, Matthew, who had put it out for those who had believed from Judaism, composed with Hebrew letters. Second, the Gospel according to Mark, who did as Peter had showed or directed him, whom he confessed even as son in his Catholic epistle, saying through these words, she who is elect in Babylon greets you, and Mark, my son. And third, the Gospel according to Luke, who has made the Gospel praised by Paul for those from the Gentiles. And to these, the Gospel according to John. John always kind of gets the short shrift at the end. Now, just a couple of sort of general observations before I go to point 2 on the outline of basic eschatological issues building on the Fathers. Number 1, there is this constant tradition in the early church that Matthew wrote his gospel in a Semitic language. You can see it in Papias. You can also see it in this last quotation here. And what's interesting about that is we have no proof for that whatsoever in terms of documentation. And I mean, I just don't know what to say about that. That essentially, whether he wrote in his own dialecto, whether that means, in a Hebrew way of arguing or something like that, but we have no proof for this. Now, people have done exercises, like, say, tried to translate the Greek into Hebrew, and they say, Jean Carmignac of France said you could do it very easily. Okay? Now, I don't know whether, that is the case or not, but yeah, go ahead. Or you just...
No, actually, I did have my hand raised. This brings up a question in our mind. When, for example, was the notion first forwarded that Matthew wrote in a Semitic language?
Under Papias.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is he the only one?
No, here, Origen says that. Now, Origen is later, but yeah, I mean, he's not the only one.
Is it possible these things become an echo chamber after a while?
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, this is entirely possible, but I'm not so sure. That's not an obvious thing to say, though, if there's no proof around. I think that's just one of the kind of conundrum of this. I just don't know.
Are there other things that become echo chambers as far as this type of eschatological goes?
I don't really think so, because, for example, Clement talks about the 2 Gospels with the genealogies written first, but the other guys all go Matthew, Mark, Luke, John.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So, there's conflicting evidence.
Yeah. But I mean, it didn't all of a sudden just start and then, once Clement says that, then everybody says it or something like this.
Well, there's a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, there's no doubt about that.
One might argue there's a little bit of textual evidence about Matthew anyway, when he talks about that passage that's coming up soon in a couple of weeks about Peter being the Petra. Jesus names him, he calls him Simon Bar-Jonah just before that verse. It's transliterated in Greek, Bar, Simon, son of John, rather than saying Ioanna. It's written in Greek like we transliterate sometimes. If we don't have a Greek or a Hebrew text in our English, we'll transliterate, spell it out in English words. Yeah. It's done in Greek language, only it's spelling out the Hebrew using the Greek letters.
But see, the problem is, take that passage.
Yeah.
As far as I know, you can't do the linguistic trick with Peter and rock in Aramaic or Hebrew. See, that's actually a Greek trick.
Yeah, I get you. Yeah, because it's like poetic.
Yeah.
A wordplay thing.
So, yeah, I mean, I don't want to get sidetracked here because we're doing Mark, but it's just an interesting thing to talk about.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Now, let's go to point number 2. Authorship. Everybody says in the scholarly world that we don't know who wrote the Gospels. Mark Allen Powell, in his very well-selling Isagogics book, says the book is anonymous and we can only guess at the identity of the author. He says, by the beginning of the 2nd century, Christians were writing according to Mark on manuscripts. Yeah, but you know what? We don't have any manuscript in existence that doesn't say it. Okay? So this is like having every copy of the Declaration of Independence somehow saying Thomas Jefferson, and then you say, yeah, but we don't know who wrote it. Because these are only copies. Well, the people aren't just pulling this out of thin air, for heaven's sake. And I mean, this is actually a kind of an important point. So the manuscripts, whenever we have a manuscript that has an indication of authorship, either at the beginning or at the end, because sometimes it's at the end, they all say, according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, according to John. So, just to say something like that is simply not right. What would you say? Every testimony is that some guy named Mark wrote this. Now, the question is, who is that? I am not going to spend a lot of time on this because I don't think it makes any difference. We are reading the text. Now, Troy, this goes back to what we were discussing. I don't think you got to psych out the author here in any sense. I am going to be getting the meaning of the gospel from reading the text. I am not getting the meaning of the gospel by somehow determining who Mark was and then in some way intuiting what the meaning of this is. So it's probably John Mark from Acts, who was probably Mark, the son of Peter, in 1 Peter 5, but we don't know any of that for absolute certainty. There is take a look in your Bibles here. Take a look toward the end of the Pauline epistles. This is interesting here. Take a look at Philemon. Or as they say in England, Philemon. And let's have a reading of 23 and 24. Okay, who's got that in a translation? Philemon. Yeah. Chapter 1. All right. Yeah.
23 and 24.
Yeah.
Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, greet you, as do Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, Luke, my fellow laborer.
All right. So Mark and Luke are there with Paul in prison. I follow the Rica understanding. It's prison in Caesarea, when Paul was in prison under first Felix and then Festus. Now, so probably this is the guy who was with Peter. C.E.B. Cranfield argues very strongly that the vividness of detail of the various pericopes argues for, a real inner circle guy like Peter to be involved in this. And there is, by the way, here's an interesting little backdoor thing that it's associated with Peter. Take a look at Acts 10, please. Acts 10. And it's a speech of Peter. This is in reference to Cornelius and so forth.
What verse?
Well, I'm coming to that. All right. His speech is 36 to 41. But take a look at, let's just say, 36 to 38. Okay, would you read that again, please? Go ahead.
The word which God sent to the children of Israel, peace through Jesus Christ, he is Lord of all. That word which is proclaimed to all Judea and began from Galilee after the baptism which John preached. How God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and with power, who went about doing good and healing all who were oppressed by the devil, for God was with him.
Okay, now look at verse 37. And people have noticed this is actually the outline of the Gospel of Mark in huge strokes. So you have here, the word, the thing that has happened throughout all Judea, beginning from Galilee, after the baptism of John, baptism which John preached. So run it backwards. John and his baptism, ministry in Galilee, Judea at the end. See, so it's sort of the broad outline of the Gospel of Mark. There aren't multiple trips to Jerusalem and stuff like that. So the Petrine connection, I think is pretty solid. It's pretty solid. Now, what about the date? Well, this is all level 3 interpretation, reading stuff, concluding about text production. I follow Bo Rika in that all of the books of the New Testament are written before 70 AD. All of the books of the New Testament are written before 70. And one of the principal reasons is that there is no reference actually to the fall of Jerusalem. So for example, let's say something like if Mark would be making a comment after Jesus' wicked tenants of the vineyard, that the vineyard is going to be taken from these people and so on like that. Well, man, it'd be so natural just to talk about that as...
Here goes to show it.
You want to see it? Yeah. Or Book of Hebrews is arguing about Christ's sacrifice being much more important than the sacrifice of bulls and goats, which have to go on repeatedly. How about saying, which are clearly now ended because the temple is gone? See, so there's all kinds of, but Rika argued on many, many different fronts on this. This is just the cheap, quick, dirty, and nuclear version of why it is likely to be before 70. But let's just say this. You heard me read the church fathers, right? What do they say? They're preaching the, gospel in Rome and so on like that in the 60s. So everything points to this being before the great cataclysmic fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. In fact, one thing that's interesting is I had never heard this before Rika. Rika and I had a conversation about this, and he said, people say, well, read the story, read what Jesus says in Mark 13 or Matthew 24 about the fall of Jerusalem. And he said, actually, there aren't any details. It's what he called absolute eschatology, just about how this great fall is going to take place. But, he doesn't say stuff like this. The third legion's going to be on the south side or something like that. There's none of that stuff that you could say, well, the guy is concocting this on the basis of stuff he already knew. No, there's nothing that would betray any of that as having happened yet. Okay, now, I'll say more in just a bit about the recipients, but I think the recipients are probably people in Rome. Clement implies believers in Rome. Irenaeus says that Mark wrote after the exodus of Peter and Paul in Rome, and it implies that it was there. So it's not stated as a fact by everybody, but I think there's a strong supposition that that is the case. Now, what about the production of the gospel? He does not have, I've got sources and composition. It looks like Mark is using eyewitness accounts from Peter. He doesn't talk at all about having sources the way Luke does. So he probably just is talking about from Peter. But in addition, there is another interesting fact that Rika pointed out, and it is this. In Acts 12, it talks about the apostles meeting in the home of Mary, the mother of John Mark. And if the apostles met in that home and Mark was there, then Matthew and Mark were together in Jerusalem. We saw in Philemon 24 that Mark and Luke were together. So that means that Mark is in a way sort of a linchpin between the other two gospel writers. We shouldn't be surprised, we should not be surprised that there are places where Matthew and Mark agree and places where Mark and Luke agree, but fewer places where Matthew and Luke agree against Mark. So Rika was always very big on the fact that the congruences were actually as a result of what he would call personal interaction of the evangelists. That is to say, not that they're sitting around manuscripts and going, I'm changing the aorist to the imperfect, something like that, but that they actually conversed with one another and would have talked about stuff like this. Yeah.
So, dependence on one another, it's gospels. Let's talk about that for a minute.
I don't know if I'd say dependence. I would just say interaction.
Okay. I have no room in my brain or heart left for historical criticism at all.
Yeah. No, right.
But they're always living in an echo chamber. One depends on the other, and you've got a synoptic problem.
But remember, that's always literary dependence. See, all historical criticism and any kind of dependency is a literary dependence. So that Mark is copying from Matthew and Luke, or there's Mark and Matthew and Luke are copying from Mark. Well, what Rika is saying, there are a lot of similarities like in phraseology and stuff like that. This is best explained just by the fact that guys discuss stuff with each other. Not that some guy's running around in another guy's manuscript and kind of messing around with it.
There need be no dependency, in my opinion.
No. Yeah. And there need be no dependency.
In my opinion, all four of them stand on their own.
Well, sure.
Period.
And by the way,
Sorry, sir.
if you would read my commentary, you would see that one of the things I do is I basically interpret Mark on the basis of Mark. I do not, and this would be by contrast a Dave Scare move, I do not constantly reference the other Gospels to see how a guy is doing something independently. I'm figuring you're in the first century, you get the thing in Rome from Mark, nobody's saying something like, Yaakov, you got Luke over there? Let's check it out. No, I mean, you basically got the thing and you read the thing. It's got to stand on its own. It's got to stand on its own. But just, it's sort of explaining the similarities, they might very well have known each other. But I do want to say there is this oddity that everybody should be aware of, which is, I said before, but I'm going to say it again. There are many places in which, in the wording, Matthew and Mark agree against Luke, so to speak, are different than Luke. There are many places in which Mark and Luke agree in their wording and are different than Matthew. But there are precious few instances, I think there are 8 or something like that, in which Matthew and Luke agree against Mark. And that has always sort of befuddled people, that somehow Mark is this linchpin in relationships, and the Riker solution is deliciously simple. Yeah, he knew Matthew, he knew Luke, Matthew didn't know Luke. It's just kind of as simple as that. So, I'm just talking about this as, you have to watch out about Kavoris getting too aufgeregt about all this.
I got questions.
But I mean, I'm not, please understand, I'm just talking about some interesting characteristics. I am not saying, here's the key to interpreting Mark, is knowing that it would, we're going to be interpreting Mark kind of on its own and not in relation to how he supposedly made changes from something else or whatever. Okay. You okay?
Almost.
Yeah, I know.
That leads to this question. You said Mark was written for these people in Rome and so on.
Yeah.
It sounds like it was written to individuals. I don't think that's the case. I think it was written by the church for the church, purposely, meaning by the church. Mark writing it for the church, not for some individuals in Rome, but for the church, to be used in the church and by the church.
Well, no, I don't think there's any problem with that. But I think it was written to the Christians at Rome.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And and that's the gospel that they no doubt read in their weekly literature.
Yeah.
Or daily literature.
It would have been, this is exactly right. But I say this in contradistinction from a few more recent attempts by people like Richard Bauckham, who's a very, very fine scholar. He was at Cambridge with me. Who says, well, the Gospels don't have any specific provenance. They're kind of for the church at large. I think the testimony of the early fathers is that they were written in a certain circumstance, in a certain kind of setting, and so on like that. Now, they're for the whole church, but, and this is what I said to Bauckham, I had an argument with him in Africa once at a conference, and I said, you laugh, we were sitting at a game reserve in Kruger National Park in South Africa, and I brought this up, and I said, Richard, I think the problem with your theory here is that it's disproved by the Pauline epistles. Because in the Pauline epistles, you have Paul saying in Colossians, after you've read what I've written to you, it should be read by the
Church of
Laodicea. And what I've written to them, you should read. Well, okay. Obviously, he wrote the Colossian epistle to the Colossians. But then he says it has wider applicability. See, I think that's actually your answer to this. It in the first instance, goes to this group of people, and it has wider applicability.
So I put it this way. When the Gospel of Mark was complete and the ink was dry and it arrived in Rome, it probably was the only gospel that church knew.
That's what I'm thinking.
And they're in the same with Luke and John and so on, but very, very shortly thereafter, these things that have been caught on like wildfire, and suddenly there were four everywhere.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah. Now, we're going to talk about that a little bit under its canonical status. Yeah. No, that's good. All right, let's go to genre. Everybody talks about what are the Gospels, are they historiography, are they the life, like a life of a famous man? Is it something new? Well, Larry Hurtado reminded us that actually details of Jesus' life and his work death and resurrection, did limit what these guys could do. I mean, they couldn't just kind of make stuff up all over the place. So you want to talk about them being literary, which I think they are, they're still constrained by the general historical nature of what's going on. But I'd like to lay before you the notion that the three synoptic gospels each have a different genre. That Luke is Hellenistic historiography. Hellenistic means at the time, 300 BC until, 300 AD, time of our Lord. Matthew is seen as a life, a bitos, that's the term in Greek, and you see this like, some of you people have heard about like Plutarch's lives of great men. It would be like that. And a guy named Puskas, Charles Puskas, says he thinks that Mark is like a tragedy, a Greek tragedy. And here is the way he puts this on. Now just listen to this. This is pretty good. He says, for Aristotle, tragedy concerned human beings in action, which means the plot is the most important feature of the story. The effective plot has a complication, a turning point, and a denouement, bracketed by, in the front, a prologue, and then an epilogue at the end. Mark displays these characteristics with a prologue, 1:1-8, and an epilogue, 16:1-8, the Easter morning scene. Surrounding action with a central turning point comprising the healing of the blind man in 2 stages that is unique to Mark, Mark 8:22-26. He says, puts the hands on the guy, he says, what do you see? He said, I see men walking around like trees. What do you see now? Oh, I see all things clearly. Okay, so that incident is unique to Mark. And then you have the revelation of the nature and the destiny of the Son of Man with the passion and resurrection prediction. Now, in a drama, in a tragedy, the character or ethos of the protagonist is key. This central figure should be characterized by moral purpose, be realistic, and fall into misfortune not by doing evil, but through some flaw, not a moral failure, but a moral bent that becomes a liability. Like, for example, Jesus doing the destiny of his Father. What your will is, he's going to do. Mark's Jesus is all too realistically human, and his desire to fulfill his mission leads him to a tragic end. Then point 3. The tragic drama should also have a strong impact conveyed by clear and unornamented diction. And Mark's Greek is clear and not super fancy. Mark's gospel does have strong illocutionary force, impact, facilitated by the intensity of its action, by rising conflict, and by the nature of its characters, and its linguistic characteristics are appropriate for oral or dramatic presentation, especially the widespread present tense, historical present. So, understanding Mark as a tragedy on the basic story is helpful in a couple of respects. Number 1, it helps us to understand the unique portrayal, which I'll be talking about in just a few minutes, of the character of Jesus. He's a strange kind of character. And the focus upon action rather than monologues like in the Gospel of John. 2, the centrality of the turn from misunderstanding to understanding of Jesus' person and work. All of a sudden, there is this revelation in the passion and resurrection predictions. And then 3, the feeling that Jesus, as the protagonist, is moving inexorably to his fate. And it helps to explain an Easter scene ending as it does as kind of epilogue at 16. And we'll talk about that in great detail, mostly tomorrow. So, I would also like to suggest that seeing it as a drama is helpful in two other respects. Number one, it comports really well with Clement of Alexandria saying that Mark was written after Matthew and Luke. And you do a drama after you have a straight story. That is to say, Shakespeare did not write Julius Caesar before Plutarch wrote the life of Julius Caesar. First there is the life, and then you can have a drama. So I think, in my view, Mark's gospel assumes you know the story. It is not a primitive first shot at it. It assumes you know the story. And it is a different sort of take on the story. Just like the Gospel of John is a different take upon the story. So, an analogy I've sometimes used is in movies. Movie Life of Jesus, you will get the greatest story ever told, or Jesus of Nazareth. Only after that do you get Jesus Christ Superstar. See, that sort of drama on the story is sort of assuming you know the story. That doesn't come first. So I like this idea of the drama, and I think it fits into the idea of Papias that Peter spoke to the needs of the people. In other words, this is kind of addressing certain very big issues.
And that he composed.
What's that?
And that he composed.
Yeah, that he composed it. Yes, good.
Since I didn't have you as a foundational part of my training, relative to your schema that I just learned for the first time today, is not this part of our discussion, rather than so much a learning of the mind of the intended hearer, is not our discussion today, this part, which I find fascinating, don't misunderstand, is this not level 3 level 3 stuff?
Yeah. No,
Okay,
only level 3.
just making sure. I'm trying to make sure I get it.
No, you're right.
Okay.
This is all level 3, and we leave all this behind.
Okay, we're all good. I just
Yep,
trying to make
yep.
sure I'm assimilating.
You got
Okay.
it. But I gotta do this, or
To engage, yeah.
no, or Kavoris gets on me. See, so now if you're gonna just, bypass
I get it
this
fully. I get it. I just want to make sure I'm assimilating what you're taught
You are on it
before.
like fur on a weasel.
Or flies on you know what.
Okay, that's it. Let's just leave that.
I told you I was the earthy guy.
Yeah. All right, let's take a look at integrity and textual criticism. F and G. Yeah.
Quick point of clarification.
Yeah.
When you say that Mark is writing people who know the story, do you mean the written or the oral account? I mean, do they know the beta? Or the...
Well, I would say that, they know the basic story. For example, I'll give you a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Chapter 1. John the Baptist comes on the scene. Jesus is baptized. Then it says, after John was handed over, Jesus went to Galilee. What do you mean after John was handed over? What are you talking about? You got to know the story for that to make any sense. And I think there are just indications like that. I wouldn't be surprised with the short version of the temptation that he's sort of thinking people know the threefold temptation with Matthew and Luke. It doesn't need to lay all that out. But that business, I broached that at an SBL meeting, actually, is that thing about after John had been handed over. I was saying, this can't be for a bunch of people totally ignorant about the story. You wouldn't know what you're talking about with a statement like that.
But you're not necessarily stating that they knew Matthew and Luke's gospel.
Correct. I am not stating that.
Nor are you refuting that they do.
No, that's right. No,
They're aware of the life of Jesus Christ, whether that life is written or oral.
yeah, and they're aware of the basic things. They're aware there was a John the Baptist and that he got killed and stuff like that. But I think before Mark writes his gospel, they very well may not have known about the birthday party and all that kind of stuff. So Mark fills in tons of detail in a way that other gospels don't have, which is very interesting. Okay, now my watch stopped, so I'm going to have to look at my phone here. Now, how do you want to play this? It's 2:30.
Oh,
I just wind me up and let me go. So don't rely on me getting tired.
let's take a brief break.
You want to take a brief break, okay?